On the night of March 14, 1941, two men sat across from each other in a back room off 116th Street in Harlem, and before the sun rose, the balance of organized crime in New York City had shifted forever. One was Frank Costello, the urbane Italian mobster who controlled slot machines, political favors, and half the judges in Manhattan. The other was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known on every corner north of 110th Street as Bumpy, a black enforcer with a fearsome reputation but no empire of his own. The stakes were immediate and concrete: control of the numbers racket in Harlem, an underground lottery generating an estimated $300,000 per week in Depression-era cash, and the question of whether Italian syndicates would continue their grip on black neighborhoods or whether a black boss could rise to power with their blessing. By the time the two men shook hands, Dutch Schultz was 5 years dead, the old guard was fractured, and the Luciano family needed a lieutenant in Harlem who could deliver peace, profit, and order. Bumpy Johnson walked into that room as muscle. He walked out as a king, and by morning, the word on Lenox Avenue was clear. The Italians had made a deal, and Harlem now answered to one of its own. This is a reconstructed account based on public reporting, historical records, and widely circulated accounts. Some details vary across sources, and certain meetings were conducted in secrecy, where specifics remain disputed. This narrative reflects the most consistent version as understood by historians and law enforcement observers of the era. The spark that brought Costello and Bumpy to the table didn't come from ambition, it came from blood and chaos. In late February 1941, a policy banker named Nat Pettigrew was found shot dead in the back seat of a Packard on West 145th Street, his pockets turned inside out and $2,300 missing. Pettigrew had been collecting numbers money for a crew loosely aligned with the remnants of Dutch Schultz's old operation, which had been absorbed piecemeal by the Luciano organization after Schultz was murdered in a Newark chop house in 1935. But Pettigrew's death wasn't a simple robbery. It was a message. Within 48 hours, two more collectors were beaten so badly they couldn't work, and a policy bank on 8th Avenue was firebombed at 3 in the morning. No one claimed responsibility, but the neighborhood knew. Independent black operators, tired of kicking up tribute to white gangsters downtown, were pushing back. Frank Costello, who had taken over day-to-day command of the Luciano family, while Lucky Luciano himself sat in prison upstate, faced a problem he couldn't solve with intimidation alone. Harlem's numbers racket was too profitable to abandon. Weekly gross revenues were conservatively estimated at $15,000 per block in the busiest precincts, but it was also too volatile to control from a distance. White enforcers who crossed 110th Street were met with stony silence and, increasingly, violence. Police were either on the take or indifferent, and the community saw the Italian syndicates as occupiers extracting wealth without offering protection or respect. Costello understood that brute force would turn Harlem into a war zone, drive business underground, and attract federal attention at a moment when the syndicate was trying to modernize and legitimize its operations. He needed a proxy someone, black, respected, feared, and capable of holding territory without constant backup from downtown. Bumpy Johnson, then in his mid-30s, had spent the previous decade as an enforcer, a debt collector, and a survivor. He had done time in Sing Sing for armed robbery, earned a reputation for cold-blooded efficiency, and commanded loyalty among the street crews who ran dice games, protection rackets, and small-time narcotics. He wasn't a kingpin, not yet, but he was known. Observers on the street described him as intelligent, disciplined, and utterly without sentimentality when it came to business. He had also shown a willingness to work with the Italians when it suited him, a pragmatism that set him apart from hotheads who preferred pride over profit. The meeting was brokered by intermediaries with ties to both camps, men who understood that continued bloodshed would cost everyone money. Accounts differ on the exact terms discussed that night, but the framework was clear. Costello's organization would recognize Bumpy Johnson as the primary controller of Harlem's numbers operations. In exchange, Bumpy would deliver a percentage of gross revenues downtown, maintain order, prevent freelance violence, and ensure that no independents challenged the arrangement. It was a franchise agreement wrapped in a handshake, and it carried an unspoken corollary: betray the deal and the full weight of the syndicate would come down on him. Accept it, and Bumpy would become the most powerful black gangster in New York. Friday, March 14, 11:45 p.m. The meeting concludes in a storefront social club on East 116th Street, a neutral zone where Italian and black operators occasionally do business. Bumpy Johnson and Frank Costello shake hands. No contracts are signed, no lawyers present. Costello's driver waits outside. Bumpy walks out alone. Witnesses later recalled seeing him light a cigarette on the corner, standing under a street lamp for several minutes before disappearing into the night. One observer told police years later that Bumpy looked calm, almost contemplative, as if he understood the weight of what had just occurred. Saturday, March 15 to 8:30 a.m. Word spreads through Harlem's policy networks with the speed of a brush fire. Collectors, runners, and bank operators receive visits from Bumpy's lieutenants, men who had been low-level enforcers the day before and now carried the authority of a new regime. The message is simple: operations continue as usual, but all payments now route through Bumpy's chain of command. Resistance will not be tolerated. Several independent operators, skeptical of the sudden power shift, demand proof. By noon, Bumpy himself appears at a pool room on Lenox Avenue, flanked by 4 men, and delivers a quiet 3-minute speech. No one recorded his exact words, but those present described the tone as matter-of-fact and final. One pool room regular later said, "He didn't threaten, he didn't need to. You could see it in his eyes." This wasn't a negotiation. Saturday, March 15th to 2 p.m., a known holdout, a policy banker named Clarence Jitney Wade, who had been operating independently since the Schultz days, refuses to meet with Bumpy's emissaries. Wade controls 3 blocks near the Polo Grounds and has a reputation for toughness. His refusal is seen as a test. If Bumpy can't bring Wade into line, the entire arrangement collapses before it begins. Accounts differ on what happens next. Some sources claim Wade was beaten and his bank shut down within hours. Others suggest a more measured approach: phone calls, warnings, and the quiet withdrawal of protection that Wade had previously enjoyed from other crews. What is certain is that by Sunday morning, Wade's operation is closed, and he is nowhere to be found. Police receive no missing person report. The neighborhood understands. Saturday, March 15 to 7 p.m., Bumpy meets with his inner circle at an apartment on Strivers Row, an enclave where Harlem's black elite doctors, entertainers, numbers King's Keep residences. The meeting lasts 3 hours. No minutes are recorded, but participants later described a detailed operational briefing: how revenue would be collected, who would handle enforcement, how disputes would be resolved, and what percentage would flow downtown to Costello's organization. Bumpy reportedly outlined a tiered management structure, with himself at the top, 3 regional lieutenants below him, and a network of runners and collectors at the street level. He emphasized discipline, predictability, and the absolute necessity of keeping violence to a minimum. "We're not cowboys," one attendee recalled him saying. "We're businessmen now." Sunday, March 16 to 10:15 a.m. Churches across Harlem hold services, and ministers, many of whom depend on discreet donations from policy operators, sense the shift. Some preach against gambling and vice, fulfilling their public role. Others remain silent, understanding that the numbers racket employs hundreds of residents and circulates thousands of dollars weekly through a community starved for capital during the Depression. One pastor later told a reporter off the record that he prayed for peace, not purity, because peace meant his congregants could feed their families. Sunday, March 16th or 3 p.m. A delegation of Italian mobsters, mid-level captains from the Luciano family, arrives in Harlem to observe the transition firsthand. They visit 3 policy banks, meet briefly with Bumpy, and leave without incident. Their presence is a signal. The deal is real, and it has the backing of the most powerful criminal organization in the city. Observers note that the Italians are courteous, almost deferential, a stark departure from the heavy-handed tactics of the Schultz era. The message is clear: Bumpy is not a puppet. He is a partner, albeit a junior one. Monday, March 17 to 9 a.m., the first full day of operations under the new regime proceeds smoothly. Runners collect bets, banks process slips, and payouts are made to winners without interruption. Revenue flows upward through Bumpy's network, and by evening, the first installment of tribute is delivered downtown to Costello's representatives. The amount is rumored to be $15,000, roughly 5% of the week's gross take, a figure that satisfies the Italians and leaves Bumpy with substantial profit and operating capital. No violence is reported, no arrests are made. The transition, against all odds, appears seamless. Monday, March 17 to 11:30 p.m. Bumpy Johnson is seen at the Red Rooster, a nightclub on 7th Avenue, sitting at a corner table with a clear view of the entrance. He drinks sparingly, speaks quietly with associates, and leaves before midnight. Patrons later recalled that the atmosphere felt different that night, tense, expectant, as if everyone understood they were witnessing the beginning of a new era. One musician performing that evening said years later, "You could feel the power shift. It was like a storm had passed, and we were all waiting to see what the weather would be like tomorrow." To understand why Frank Costello, a Calabrian immigrant who controlled judges and union bosses, would willingly share power with a black enforcer from North Carolina, you have to understand the decade that preceded the deal and the 2 men who shaped it. Bumpy Johnson, the making of a boss. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905 and came north to Harlem during the Great Migration, part of the flood of black Southerners seeking escape from Jim Crow terror and economic suffocation. He arrived as a teenager with little money and no connections, and Harlem in the 1920s offered limited, legitimate pathways to power. What it did offer was a thriving underworld, speakeasies during Prohibition, after-hours gambling dens, numbers rackets, and protection schemes. Johnson fell in with street crews, learned to fight, and earned his nickname Bumpy, reportedly from a pronounced bump on the back of his head, the result of a childhood injury. He was smart, observant, and ruthless when necessary. By his mid-20s, he was working as muscle for Stephanie St. Clair, a black numbers queen who controlled a significant share of Harlem's policy operations and who became both his mentor and his model for how to survive in a world dominated by white organized crime. St. Clair, known as Queenie, was a formidable operator who refused to bend to the Italian and Jewish mobs moving into Harlem in the early 1930s. She fought Dutch Schultz's encroachment with violence, legal maneuvering, and media exposure, even taking out newspaper advertisements denouncing corruption. But Schultz, a volatile and brutal gangster, had the resources and manpower to overwhelm her. By the mid-1930s, St. Clair's empire was fractured, and Bumpy, caught in the crossfire, was arrested on robbery charges and sent to Sing Sing. He served nearly a decade, maintaining contacts on the outside and building a reputation as someone who kept his mouth shut and his mind sharp. When he was released in 1939, Harlem's landscape had changed. Schultz was dead, murdered in 1935 on orders from the newly formed Commission Organized Crimes Ruling Council because his erratic behavior and plans to assassinate a prosecutor threatened everyone. The Luciano family had absorbed Schultz's operations, but they lacked trusted leadership in Harlem. Bumpy returned to a power vacuum, and he was uniquely positioned to fill it. Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld. Frank Costello was everything Dutch Schultz was not: smooth, patient, and politically sophisticated. Born Francesco Castiglia in Calabria, Italy, in 1891, he came to New York as a child and rose through the ranks of organized crime during Prohibition, specializing in bootlegging, gambling, and the kind of political corruption that kept law enforcement at bay. By 1941, with Lucky Luciano imprisoned on prostitution charges and other bosses focused on narcotics and labor racketeering, Costello had become the public face of the Luciano family's operations. He dressed like a banker, spoke softly, and cultivated relationships with Tammany Hall politicians, judges, and police captains. His gambling empire stretched from Manhattan to New Orleans, and his slot machine business alone generated tens of thousands of dollars weekly. But Costello understood something that many of his peers did not. Sustainable profit required stability, and stability required legitimacy, or at least the appearance of it. He avoided unnecessary violence, preferring bribery and negotiation. He saw Harlem not as territory to occupy, but as a market to manage, and he recognized that heavy-handed control by white outsiders was becoming untenable. The neighborhood was increasingly politically conscious, with civil rights organizations, black newspapers, and community leaders pushing back against exploitation. Federal investigators were beginning to scrutinize mob activities in black communities, and the last thing Costello wanted was a race riot or a high-profile crackdown that could unravel his broader operations. A black proxy, someone who could maintain order and deliver profits while insulating the Italians from direct exposure, was the logical solution. The Schultz legacy and the power vacuum Dutch Schultz's reign over Harlem's numbers racket in the early 1930s had been profitable but chaotic. Schultz used violence indiscriminately, alienating the community and drawing police attention. When he was killed in 1935, his operations were divided among several Luciano captains, but none had the local knowledge or respect to manage Harlem effectively. Independent operators began to reassert themselves, and violence flared sporadically. The Luciano family collected tribute, but enforcement was inconsistent, and profits were leaking. Costello, pragmatic and forward-thinking, understood that the old model white gangsters extracting money from black neighborhoods through fear was unsustainable. He needed someone who could command loyalty from within the community, someone who understood the streets and could operate with a degree of autonomy while respecting the larger power structure. Why Bumpy? Several factors made Bumpy Johnson the ideal candidate. First, his reputation. He was feared but not hated, respected for his toughness but also known for a degree of fairness in his dealings. Second, his intelligence. Unlike many street-level enforcers, Bumpy understood the economics of the rackets and had learned from Stephanie St. Clair how to manage operations, not just muscle. Third, his pragmatism. He had no illusions about overthrowing the Italian syndicates and was willing to work within the existing power structure if it meant gaining autonomy and profit. And fourth, His timing, he returned from prison at precisely the moment when Costello needed a solution in Harlem, and he had no serious rivals who could challenge his rise. Observers who knew both men later described the arrangement as a meeting of mutual necessity. Costello needed order and profit in Harlem without direct involvement. Bumpy needed capital, protection from rivals, and the implicit backing of the most powerful crime family in New York. The deal was not born of friendship or ideology. It was a cold calculation by two men who understood that power is best exercised through leverage, not force. And in March 1941, their interests aligned perfectly. The numbers racket, also called policy, the numbers game, or simply the number, was the economic engine that made Bumpy Johnson's rise possible and Frank Costello's investment worthwhile. To an outsider, it looked like a simple lottery. To those who ran it, it was a sophisticated financial operation generating massive cash flow with minimal overhead and virtually no legitimate competition. How it worked every day, thousands of Harlem residents placed small bets, typically a nickel, a dime, or a quarter on a three-digit number between 0000 and 999. The winning number was determined by a publicly verifiable source, most commonly the last three digits of the total handle at a designated racetrack, published in the next day's newspapers. This external determination was crucial. It prevented accusations of rigging and gave the game legitimacy in the eyes of players. If your number hit, you won at odds of roughly 600 to 1, though the actual payout varied by operator. A nickel bet could return $30, a life-changing sum for a domestic worker or day laborer during the Depression. The brilliance of the system lay in its mathematics. With 999 possible outcomes and payouts set well below true odds, the house edge was enormous. Operators kept roughly 40% of gross revenue as profit after paying winners and covering operating costs. In a neighborhood where thousands played daily, even small individual bets aggregated into staggering totals. Conservative estimates suggest that Harlem's numbers racket generated between $15,000 and $20,000 per day in the early 1940s, or well over $5 million annually, at a time when the average American worker earned less than $1,500 per year. The infrastructure running a numbers operation required a multi-layered organization. At the street level, runners collected bets door to door, in barber shops, at newsstands, and in social clubs. Runners worked on commission, typically keeping 10 to 15% of the money they collected. They passed bets and cash up to controllers, mid-level managers who oversaw specific blocks or neighborhoods. Controllers consolidated the bets, tracked liabilities, how much would be owed if certain popular numbers hit, and delivered cash to policy banks, the nerve centers where bets were recorded, winners were determined, and payouts were distributed. At the top sat the bankers, the financiers who absorbed the risk and reaped the profits. A sample week's economics lets break down a single profitable week under Bumpy Johnson's regime. Gross revenue collected, $105,000, $15,000 per day across 7 days. Payouts to winners, approximately $42,000, roughly 40%, assuming an average hit rate. Commissions to runners and controllers, approximately $15,750, 15% of gross. Operating expenses, bribes to police, rent for policy banks, security, minor legal fees, approximately $5,250. Net profit before tribute, $42,000. Tribute to Costello's organization, 5% of gross, $5,250. Bumpy Johnson's weekly take, approximately $36,750. Even after payments to the Italians and operating costs, Bumpy's organization was clearing well over $35,000 weekly, or roughly $1.8 million annually, a staggering sum in 1941, equivalent to tens of millions in today's currency. And this was just the numbers racket. Control of Harlem's numbers brought with it influence over other enterprises, nightclubs, loan sharking, narcotics distribution, and protection rackets. Why people played the numbers weren't just gambling, they were hope. For residents locked out of legitimate wealth building through systemic racism, redlining, and employment discrimination, a nickel bet represented a chance, however slim, at financial escape. The game was woven into daily life. People played birthdays, addresses, dream interpretations, and hunches. Churches condemned it, but even preachers understood that the numbers employed hundreds and circulated desperately needed cash through a community starved for capital. The moral calculus was complicated, and Bumpy Johnson, whatever his methods, was seen by many as preferable to the white gangsters who had preceded him. The rise of Bumpy Johnson presented a dilemma for law enforcement and a complex set of emotions for Harlem's residents. Neither group was monolithic, and both responded with a mix of resignation, complicity, and quiet resistance. Police, corruption, and selective enforcement. The New York Police Department in 1941 was deeply compromised by organized crime. Plainclothes officers in Harlem precincts routinely accepted payoffs from numbers operators, and even uniformed patrolmen looked the other way in exchange for cash or favors. The amounts were not trivial. A policy banker might pay a beat cop $20 to $50 weekly, the equivalent of half a month's legitimate salary, to ensure that raids were telegraphed in advance or that arrests were token gestures producing no serious charges. Higher-ranking officers and precinct commanders took larger cuts, and some detectives acted as de facto mediators in disputes between rival operators. When Bumpy Johnson consolidated power, the financial arrangements shifted but did not disappear. Investigators believe that Costello's political connections ensured that police pressure remained manageable. Periodic raids occurred necessary for appearances and newspaper coverage, but they targeted small-time independents or operators who had fallen behind on payments, not Bumpy's core organization. One retired detective, speaking decades later, described the arrangement bluntly. "We knew who ran what. We knew where the banks were. But orders came from above: keep it quiet, keep it controlled, and don't make waves." Federal authorities, including the FBI and Treasury agents investigating tax evasion, were aware of Harlem's numbers racket, but focused their resources elsewhere. In 1941, national attention was shifting toward the looming war in Europe and the Pacific, and domestic organized crime was a lower priority unless it involved espionage or defense industry corruption. Bumpy Johnson, careful to avoid flamboyant displays of wealth and to keep violence to a minimum, did not trigger the kind of federal scrutiny that had brought down Al Capone or would later ensnare other mob bosses. Community, ambivalence, and pragmatism for Harlem's residents. Bumpy's rise was met with a complicated mix of pride, fear, and pragmatism. He was one of them, a black man who had seized power in a world controlled by whites, who employed local people, and who was known to settle disputes without unnecessary brutality. Stories circulated, some true and some embellished, of Bumpy helping families in need, paying medical bills, or funding funerals. These acts of charity, whether genuine benevolence or calculated public relations, reinforced his image as a Robin Hood figure, a narrative that community. Leaders found frustrating but difficult to counter. Churches and civil rights organizations condemned the numbers as a scourge, draining money from families who could not afford to gamble and perpetuating cycles of poverty. The NAACP and the Urban League, both active in Harlem, pushed for economic development and legitimate employment opportunities as alternatives to the underground economy. But their efforts faced an uphill battle. Legal jobs were scarce, discriminatory, and low-paying, while the numbers offered immediate cash and the dream of a windfall. Most residents simply adapted. They placed their bets, hoped to win, and avoided asking too many questions about who controlled the game. Bumpy Johnson, for better or worse, was now the king, and kings especially in Harlem in 1941 were facts of life, not choices. Scenario 1. Retreat. In this scenario, Bumpy Johnson, overwhelmed by the pressures of leadership or facing unexpected resistance from independent operators or rival Italian factions, steps back from the deal. He either returns to a lower-profile role as an enforcer or leaves Harlem entirely, ceding control back to Costello's organization. This outcome seems implausible given Bumpy's reputation and ambition, but it is not impossible. The cost would be immense: loss of face, loss of income, and likely elimination by rivals who would see his retreat as weakness. Costello, meanwhile, would face renewed instability in Harlem and the prospect of finding another proxy or resorting to direct control, neither of which are appealing. This scenario is the least likely of the three but cannot be entirely dismissed, particularly if violence escalates beyond what either man is willing to tolerate. Scenario 2. Negotiated settlement. In this scenario, the deal holds, but adjustments are made as realities on the ground shift. Perhaps independent operators demand a larger share of the profits, or perhaps Costello's organization, seeing the success of the Harlem model, pushes for a higher tribute percentage. Negotiations occur quietly, mediated by trusted intermediaries, and a new equilibrium is reached. This is the most stable and mutually beneficial outcome. It allows Bumpy to consolidate power while demonstrating flexibility, and it gives Costello continued revenue without direct involvement. The cost is modest. Both sides give a little. Both sides preserve the relationship, and the system continues to function profitably. This scenario aligns with both men's pragmatic temperaments and is, historically, what appears to have unfolded over the following years. Scenario 3. All-out escalation. In this scenario, the deal collapses. Perhaps a rival black operator, unwilling to accept Bumpy's authority, launches a violent challenge. Perhaps an ambitious Italian captain, resentful of sharing power with a black boss, moves against Bumpy with or without Costello's blessing. The result is a street war. Bombings, shootings, raids, and a breakdown of order that draws police and federal attention. Revenue plummets as bettors stay home and runners go into hiding. Harlem becomes a battlefield, and both sides suffer catastrophic losses: money, manpower, and political capital. This scenario is the nightmare both Bumpy and Costello work to avoid, but in the underworld, miscalculation and ego can override reason. If it happens, it will be swift, brutal, and costly for everyone involved. Within 72 hours of the initial deal, a development emerged that tested the new arrangement and clarified the stakes for all involved. On the evening of March 18, 1941, a policy bank on West 139th Street was raided by 6 armed men, the cash box emptied, and 2 employees beaten severely enough to require hospitalization. Initial reports suggested a simple robbery, but within hours, investigators on the street pieced together a different story. The raid was carried out by associates of a freelance operator who had refused to recognize Bumpy's authority and was attempting to prove that the new regime could not protect its own operations. Bumpy's response, according to multiple accounts, was immediate and unambiguous. By the following night, the rogue operator's headquarters was shuttered, his crew scattered, and the man himself had vanished from Harlem. No body was found, no arrest was made. The message was received. Police, when questioned by reporters, offered no comment and made no arrests related to either incident. Frank Costello's representatives, observing from a distance, reportedly expressed satisfaction that the situation had been handled decisively and without unnecessary publicity. This late-breaking escalation served as both a validation of the deal and a warning to potential challengers. Bumpy had demonstrated that he could enforce order without dragging the Italians into street-level violence, and Costello had demonstrated that his backing was real. The brief crisis, rather than destabilizing the arrangement, strengthened it. By the end of March, Harlem's numbers racket was operating smoothly under a command structure that would endure, with modifications, for the next 2 decades. As April 1941 approached, the deal between Frank Costello and Bumpy Johnson stood, but only because both men understood that power is never guaranteed, only maintained. The numbers continued to flow, the cash continued to move downtown, and Harlem continued to operate under a new kind of order, one where a black boss commanded the streets with the blessing of the Italian syndicates. But the underworld is never static. Rivals watched and waited. Police collected envelopes but stayed alert for shifts in the balance. Community leaders preached against vice while quietly acknowledging that the neighborhood needed the employment and capital that the numbers provided. And in Washington, federal authorities were beginning to connect the dots between local rackets and national organized crime, a process that would eventually bring scrutiny. Even to carefully managed operations like Bumpy's, the real test would come not in weeks, but in years, whether Bumpy could hold power as the city changed, as wars were fought overseas and social upheaval reshaped American cities, as heroin replaced the numbers as the underworld's most profitable product, and as civil rights movements challenged every form of exploitation, criminal and legal alike. The deal made Bumpy Johnson the king of Harlem in 1941. Whether he could remain king was a question that would take decades to answer. By the first week of April, the deadline had passed. The deal had held, and the streets of Harlem for the moment were quiet. But in the underworld, quiet never lasts forever. The clock was always ticking, and everyone knew it.